All right. Welcome back to the Lovecraft Easing podcast. Recording this on a Wednesday, not a Sunday, because I wanted to get Brian Evenson in here. He's my guest today. Uh, because I'm pretty booked up on Sundays through the next couple of months, and I really wanted to. That's my Kindle version. Talk about his new book, Good Night, Sleep Tight. So,
Cool.
thanks for being here, Brian.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
Appreciate it. Um, oh, before I forget, one of my patrons, Jeremiah, says that your Dead Space novel rocks. So
Oh,
I'm supposed
cool.
to pass that on.
I'm super glad. Tell Jeremiah thank you. I'm glad he
I
feels that
will.
way.
Let's see here. Yeah, there we go. I'm just double checking my sound. My son
Mm,
usually does this stuff for me, and I'm trying to do it on my own so I don't have to call him uh,
right,
over here
right.
so much. So anyway, yeah, I don't think there's anyone out there, it couldn't be really, who doesn't know you or at least hasn't, doesn't know who you are or read some of your work. But assuming that they are out there listening to this, can you introduce yourself? Talk a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So as you've mentioned, I'm Brian Evanson. I am someone who kind of started in the literary world, but was writing kind of weird stuff. And so people, they talked about it as innovative or strange, but as literary. And then as time's gone on, I've found more and more connections with what's going on in weird fiction and horror fiction. And so I'm really a writer who kind of straddles genres in various ways. The short story is just a form I really love. So, and then I don't know if you want information just about me, but yeah,
Sure.
I live in live in California. I teach at Cal Arts and do some stuff in TV and movies as well.
Well, most importantly, you were born in Iowa, is that right?
I was born in Iowa. I was born in Ames. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm from Des Moines.
Oh, you
So,
are? Okay.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah. I'm in
yeah.
Texas now. And, how long were you in Iowa after you were born? Just my personal
Not too long.
curiosity.
Yeah, just a couple of years. And then my dad was working on a PhD in physics in Iowa in Ames.
Yeah.
And then we moved to Philadelphia, and then after that we moved to Utah.
Um, your father moved to Utah because you guys were members of the Mormon church, right?
Yeah,
Can you I've
yeah,
noticed you've talked about that in some interviews, so I just briefly wanted to ask you about it.
sure. Yeah, I mean, I grew up Mormon. My family goes back 5 or 6 generations in the Mormon
Oh,
church.
wow.
So yeah, there were members of my my ancestors were kind of on the wagon trains across to Utah, things like that. And then my dad got a job offer at BYU, and I think because my family was Mormon, we moved back there, and yeah. So I grew up Mormon. At this point, I'm an excommunicated Mormon. I left the Mormon Church, very happily left it. There was some controversy with them over my fiction, actually. My first book, Altman's Tongue, was
Yeah, I
published.
read that. That's really
Yeah,
interesting, I guess. What is one word
yeah.
for it?
Yeah, it's one word for it. Yeah. Yeah, it's I was working at Brigham Young University, the Mormon school, when my first book came out, and there was a student there who wrote an anonymous letter to Mormon church leaders saying that the book was evil and things like that.
Yeah.
And so I had to defend myself and say what I was trying to do in the book. And it just became very clear that if I was going to stay at BYU, I was not going to be able to publish the kind of work I wanted to publish. So I ended up leaving. I kind of have lived all over the place. Before I was in Los Angeles, I was in Providence, Rhode Island. I taught at Brown out there. Before that, I was in Denver at University of Denver.
Oh, wow.
I've taught some other places as well. Mhm.
I ask for two reasons. Number one, you some of your work alludes to cults or has the theme or is
Yeah,
about cults directly.
yeah.
And number two, I grew up in a cult, so I was wondering, based on reading your stories and reading other interviews about this, do you consider it to be a cult, or you just it was unpleasant for you because of the incident and now you're gone?
You know, it's complicated. I guess
Oh,
I
I
would say.
believe
Yeah,
that.
yeah. I mean, yeah, yeah. Can I ask which cult you were involved in?
Yeah, it was in Des Moines. It was a Pentecostal
Yeah.
church, which
Yeah.
Pentecostal is very, very strange anyway.
Yeah.
But when you add in, a very authoritative leader,
Yeah.
and all these commands that everything is about being there. For example, I didn't go to public school. We couldn't have bikes or TV, all that kind
Mhm.
of stuff. That's just a couple examples, and
Yeah.
there was
Yeah.
a lot of unpleasant things that happened there too. So
Sure. Yeah. Well, so Mormonism has this thing that they say all the time, which is be in the world but not of the world.
yes, I
And
know
so
that
there's
phrase.
yeah, this whole notion of like being kind of out in the world, but you're always like holding yourself back in some way, or you're in the world differently. So there is, for me, there's a cult-like aspect of that that's a little hard to get around. But having said that, it's like I know, a lot of my family's still Mormon. I'm still connected to a lot of people who are Mormon, and there are a lot of really sensible people who somehow still are in it.
Yeah,
But it is cult adjacent, for sure. I think it's like one thing that Mormonism does is you know, it kind of programs enough of your life in terms of like church meetings in the week and things like that, and things that you do and social groups, and that it's very hard to leave it. But
yeah,
yeah, honestly, I don't have a grudge against Mormonism, but I'm also like really happy not to be part of it anymore.
yeah. Uh, well, speaking of good night, sleep tight. You know, you've got so much work out there that it would be just impossible in a short time to talk about it all. So I'll focus more on this book, which is
That's
apt.
great. Hmm.
Um, you know, I will say that you and Laird are two of the top storytellers in my mind. That
Thank you.
when I'm reading them, reading your stories, there's this sense of dread that just builds and builds and builds.
Hmm.
And there are plenty of other fine writers out there that I enjoy for other reasons, but I find that happening over and over with your work and with Laird's work, and that's kind of what I'm looking for when I read horror or
Yeah,
weird
I
fiction.
I really appreciate it. I'm a huge fan of Laird's work, and that's
Yeah.
kind of my experience with his work as well. That it has a kind of intensity to it that's unlike anything else I can think of. But yeah, it's like that's something I really look for in a reader. So it's something that I'm trying to do as a writer as well. So it means a lot to me that you feel that way.
Oh, well, I do. Good night, sleep tight. Um, I've been sharing quotes from the book online and so forth because that's what I do when I really enjoy a book. So, um, these stories, have they been published before in various places, or did you just, you,
Yeah, a lot of them have been published before. There's a few that were published in small kind of limited editions,
right?
so they're really hard to find. But I think most of them have been published before. So and yeah, it was just when I was putting the collection together, it was just trying to figure out, what can I put together that makes it feel more like a collection rather than just like a bunch of stories. So hopefully the stories kind of talk to one another too.
That's really interesting because I had the same thought reading the book,
Mm,
that there seems to be, they relate to each other really, really well. And
thank
while I
you.
was reading them also, I was trying to imagine, because I figured most of them had been in books, anthologies, or magazines before, and I was trying to imagine, where did this story go, and who wanted this one, that this
Mm,
so in the best way weird story that is just so out there,
mhm.
and they said, yes, this is what I want, Brian. So
Yeah,
I
I
mean that in
mean,
the best way.
okay. No, I totally get it. I mean, I feel like yeah, I've been very lucky in terms of editors kind of getting what I'm doing. Because I do think that there's a kind of out there-ness and weirdness to what I'm doing sometimes. And so there's a story in there that Dan Coxon took for an anthology that he did, which is just very, very weird. And I was like, I'm going to send this to Dan. He may not take it. And he took it and he liked it, but it's like often when I'm sending things to an editor, I'm thinking this is maybe not going to work out. But luckily, I mean, at this point, mostly it does. So, and if not, then no hard feelings. So,
Oh, which story was that, if you don't mind me asking?
That was I should have
I'm
gotten
looking
to
at
that,
the
but
table of
yeah,
contents right now.
it's pretty late in the collection.
Night Archer, Servitude. It does not do what you
No,
think it does. Was very
that's a weird one.
yeah. Well, all the stories are weird, but even compared to those stories, it was weird.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean that's definitely I agree with that. It was sorry about
Oh,
this.
no, no.
Um,
Yeah, it's not a big
but-
deal if you don't remember.
okay. It's I'll find it in just a minute. So um yeah.
What did you say? What was that publication?
I said I'll find it. I
Oh, okay.
didn't
I'm sorry.
not quite there, so that's okay. Um it was in it's the story that's called Under Care, which is just
Oh,
after,
yeah.
yeah, which is a very weird story about someone who is in a space that may or may not be a hospital. And yeah.
Yeah, and it seemed to me that this was a story that had two acts. If you can
Hmm.
call a short story, if you can say a short story has three acts, that
Yeah,
again, I mean that in the best way because real life doesn't always have a third act. Real life doesn't
yeah.
always explain everything.
No, that's right. Yeah. And that's, I tend to resist explanation just a little bit. So I think it's interesting you say that. It's actually a really good way to think about it because I do think there's a kind of distinct thing in that story, the first act where he's in the bed, and then second act where he leaves the bed and finds stuff. And,
Yeah.
it's not clear if he's in the same reality or what exactly's happened. Um, and then you could do a third act after that. Obviously, something's going to happen, but this is something I do a lot where I'm more interested in seeing letting the reader's mind kind of complete certain things, give them enough that their mind can kind of keep on working on the story.
Well, the very end of that particular one, I don't want spoilers, but I've already said it doesn't have a third. But basically, there was no point in fleeing, but he fled nonetheless, hoping
Hmm.
something would occur to him before the face caught up with him, but nothing did. So,
Hmm.
you know,
So the third act is in that last
right,
sentence.
exactly. I take it back.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. But it's like, I mean, it's truncated. It's like when I was a kid, I mean, everyone used to talk about when I was in high school, they would talk about Freytag's pyramid and how, you have rising action and you reach a climax and then you have a denouement. And I always used to think, why do I have to have the denouement? Why can't I just keep on rising and rising and just try to stop as close as I can to that point of tension? So,
Yeah, there are definitely several stories in this collection that in which that happens. And also, the guy in this story and other people in quotes
hmm.
in the stories, there seems to be an underlying theme in a lot of the stories of identity
Yeah.
and who am I or what am I?
Hmm.
And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit because the whole thing does seem very cohesive.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's this collection is assembled from stories. I think the oldest story was first published 10 years before the book was published, so it was probably written 11 or maybe even 12 years before. And so it's kind of, and I published, other story collections in the meantime. So there's stories in here that were written kind of at the very last minute, and there's stories that are 10 years old, and there's a lot in between. There's stories that were written kind of before the Glassy Burning Floor of Hell, which is the previous collection I published, was published, that sort of thing. And so really when I was doing this, I was trying to think about there were a couple of things I wanted to deal with. Identity is definitely one of the things. There's some confusion about identity that sometimes ties into what it means to be human or what it means to not be human. So those sorts of things were circling for me. And then there's also a kind of attention to what it means to be a parent, or a child, and then a mother,
Mm.
especially, I think, in regard to that. So those things, trying to get those things to kind of combine in an interesting way, it was really very much what putting this collection together was about for me.
Um, I really like this paragraph, which goes along with what we were just talking about. Just because we were created, and I've often had this thought, thinking about religion and,
Hmm.
a possible creator God and all that stuff. Just because we were created with a purpose, made to function as servants to our creators, must we stop existing if we have no creators to serve? No, we must simply, faced with our freedom, discover a new purpose. And it's one of the most hopeful
Mm.
lines in the book to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that is, and there's a couple of stories to me that feel hopeful in a way that most of my fiction, to be honest, doesn't. And in fact, most of the stories in here don't. But a lot of them have to do with that. I mean, I do think you're right that that's something that probably comes out of my relationship to religion and Mormonism and trying to understand what it means to leave something like that. You know, what one becomes when one leave something that has been so definitional. But you also, you take the weird residue of all that stuff along with you at the same time.
Yeah, you do.
Um, yeah, and so I feel like those questions of, who am I, and why am I here, are which are basically religious questions, or things that I'm still kind of thinking through and interested in.
Um, it seems to me, maybe it's just me, that the who am I theme
Hmm.
kind of goes hand in hand with the what is reality theme.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. Yeah, that's something with all my books. It's there's an effort to kind of question the nature of reality, to think about how reality works, and kind of put pressure on that. So there's a lot of moments in which the characters think they know or understand something, and then something it starts to slip out from under them, so that what they thought was stable is not stable.
Right.
And I do think it's like, if you if the world doesn't feel stable, that's very hard to feel stable yourself. And those two things go hand in hand, because so much about the way in which we apprehend the world is it's about perception. It's about, being kind of engaged in a kind of interpretation of what's going on around you. And so if you don't know who you are exactly, I think that interpretation can skew. But also, if like the world suddenly seems very strange, then that causes you to question yourself.
Yeah, one episode a few years back when I was interviewing Livia Llewellyn, um, I asked her the question, as I do, as I'm about to ask you, what in her view, what is weird fiction? And I said, I thought part of it was, things are not as they seem. You've got I forget which book it is, but Legati writes an introduction to one of his collections, and he talks about the two-line story.
Hmm.
The last man on earth wakes up in his bed, and the next sentence is, and he reaches for his sunglasses, or reaches for his glasses, excuse me. Um, his glasses are placed in his hand, and
Mm.
that's a two-line weird fiction story.
Yeah.
But, and she said, yeah, but also, in addition, that I am not who I think I am in a lot of
Yeah.
cases.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, I think it's both those things that end up being important. The weird is such an interesting genre. I find it like the most amazing kind of genre to be working in. Partly because it still feels very fluid and flexible in a way that like other genres are a little more like their carapace has become hardened or something.
yeah.
But there's, really interesting things going on, and there's it's really hard to talk about it, partly because I mean you have weird fiction from, the 30s and Lovecraft, where it was kind of tied to a particular publication, and where science fiction hadn't really developed completely in a way that people were thinking of it as a genre. So it's like there's horror elements, there's science fictional elements. And I feel like there's been attempts kind of along the way to kind of rethink the weird or revive the weird. So there was this moment of the new weird, which kind of mainly came up in the UK, with M. John Harrison kind of raising a conversation about it, and people talking about what the new weird would be. And then, for me, the one of the moments that was important was when Jeff and Anne Vandermeer published that huge anthology called The Weird.
Oh, yeah.
Partly because I mean the way they thought about it was, what there's all this stuff that's kind of on the edge of these different genres that maybe was published in a particular, genre, but it was like the weird thing in the magazine. It was the thing that didn't quite fit. So like David R. Bunch and things like that. It's like he's being published in science fiction magazines, but people hate it. Or they get more
Right.
complaints about his stories than anybody else. And so I got really interested because of them and just, what happens on these edges and what's more in common with, this person who's coming from science fiction, this person who's coming from horror, this person who's coming from literary fantastical fiction. They have all something in common. And it is, I think a lot of it's about the destabilization of the weird. I think it's about the destabilization of the self as well. That those things kind of end up being important to it. I think that there's often a resistance to explaining things. There's
Yeah.
that you want to kind of let things be themselves in a way. The connection to absurd literature and Kafka is definitely there too. So yeah, I mean, and then also, I mean, there's definitely a connection back to Lovecraft and all the people who are publishing Clark Ashton Smith and others who were publishing, 30 or 40 years ago. So yeah,
Yeah. What you said about, there doesn't have to be an explanation, to paraphrase.
yeah.
One time, it's been like 20 years ago, my wife and I were coming back into town from out of town. We were driving home, and it was late at night. It was this two-lane road, just imagine this creepy road with the woods on either side and so forth, occasional fields. And all at once, and we saw the same thing, there was this two-dimensional, it was what I would describe it as a shadow,
Hmm.
but it was upright. And it went
Mm.
very quickly from the right to the left, and it was person shaped.
Yeah,
You know, uh, we both saw the same thing. It happened, but there's no explanation for it. And to
yeah,
me, a lot that's a great weird fiction story. Hey,
yeah,
this strange thing happened, and I don't know what the hell's going on, and
yeah.
that's the end.
Yeah. No, I agree. And we have experiences like that. Sometimes we can figure out what they were, and other times you really can't. And they can haunt you for years, I feel like. And for me, yeah, the best weird fiction kind of puts me in a headspace that does that.
One of your stories really grapples with the question of, would you rather know the truth and be unhappy, or would you rather not know the truth and be happy? That's an oversimplification, but
Hmm.
I really enjoyed that story. And well, first of all, I'm wondering where that story came from when you wrote it,
Hmm.
if it's not too far back for you to remember. And um, yeah, I guess that's what I wanted to start with.
Okay. Which story are you think?
Um, now I'm going to do the same thing. It's towards the end.
Hmm.
Oh, it's yeah, of course. Never little, never grown.
Oh yeah, 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 absolutely. Yeah, I mean, for me, so yeah, it's a story in which someone keeps on learning something and then very deliberately forgetting it, I suppose. I don't want to give too much away,
Right.
obviously. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a kind of crucial question is like, is it better to know or not to know? And I tend, as a human, I think the way that I've lived my life has been, yeah, I want to know even if it's bad.
Yeah.
There's something about knowing things, but there's so much you just can't ever know for sure is one of the difficulties with that attitude. Um, so I kind of tend towards that, but I also really sympathize with, learning something that you don't want to know and then trying to forget it, trying to kind of move away from it. I mean, ends up being a, complicated process. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't have a great answer for that
No,
just
no,
because
that
I
that was
feel,
fine. Thank you.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh, I heard from someone or read somewhere that you were told that you write horror and you were surprised a while back.
Yeah,
And
this
Peter
is
Straub
yeah,
called your book The Open Curtain Horror, and talk
yeah,
about that and what that, what
sure.
came of that in your mind.
Yeah, so it was my book Wind Eye was nominated for a International Horror Guild Award. And I got news that this had happened, and I was just like, this was back in like 2004, maybe. I can't remember when exactly that came out, but around there. And I was just kind of surprised. I was like, oh, this is strange. They think I'm writing horror. And I don't know, it wasn't that I was a snob so much. It was just that I felt like I was doing this weird thing and it didn't really fit in either literature or horror. And then it won that award, and that made me think I probably should look at what's going on in the genre. So that was actually the beginning of me kind of starting to realize that what I thought I knew about horror just was wrong. That the genre had kind of changed and evolved, and the things I was thinking of were kind of usually really thick novels from the 70s,
Mm,
which nothing against them, but it just wasn't what I was doing. And so I read all the other collections that were up that same year, and that led me to other people, and I started reading and getting involved. And then there were people like Peter Straub, who had read already and really liked his work, and so I was not like resistant to the genre that much. But then
sure. Peter
Peter,
Straub says your work is this. You pay attention.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But Peter was teaching a class at Columbia University, and he asked the students what they were reading. I asked if I could send him The Open Curtain, which was the book that he wrote a blurb for. And he said, sure. He sent it, and he's like, here's a blurb. I just want you to know that I talk about you as a horror writer. That's like what I think you're doing, and you're on a kind of weird edge, but you're still there. And I just want to make sure you're okay with that. If you want to change that, that's fine. And by that time, I'd read enough that I was like, no, this actually makes sense to me. I want to embrace that as a kind of
Yeah.
definition. So
Well, first of all, for the people watching live, I got to apologize because there's storms everywhere, and uh, it's been lagging occasionally, which doesn't usually happen. I don't know how that'll affect the recording. I don't think it will. But anyway,
okay, if we
um,
need, we can.
oh well, thank you. That's
Yeah,
very gracious of you. Um, well, thinking about that answer, it sounds like because of Peter Straub saying, "Look, this is horror," and then you went and read the other collections and other books,
yeah.
that led you to this weird fiction community. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say. Yeah, I mean, there were a couple of moments that were important. Those two moments. Before that, Conjunctions magazine published an issue called The New Gothic, which was, felt to me like kind of what I was doing. So for a while, I called myself New Gothic, but that was a term that never really caught on. And then after that, Peter guest edited an issue of Conjunctions, which was kind of brought in both genre light writers and literary writers, and just to see what would happen. And that really, at that point, I kind of identified that as a community. And yeah, Peter actually, he was, if you knew him, he was always incredibly generous and very friendly. He was just a lovely human being. I really like Peter. I miss him a lot.
Yeah.
But he encouraged me. He was like, yeah, there was a world fantasy going on, and Peter was like, you really should go to this. You have a good time, and so he got me out to that, and I started meeting people there and getting involved with the community at that point.
A huge positive influence for you.
Yeah, and in fact, I met Laird there. That was the first
Yeah.
time I met Laird, and first time I met John Langan. They were some of the first people I met,
Oh,
and I think Peter
yeah, that
introduced
guy.
them. Yeah, yeah. And so, that was like, and they have both been really important to me. Paul, I don't remember if Paul Tremblay was there, but very quickly I was reading his work, and Stephen Graham Jones and Livia Llewellyn as well. I really admire her work. So yeah, slowly it just started to build.
Um, Tell me a little bit about your other work. And right now, you're writing a TV show that you have to be vague about.
Yeah,
Um, am I reading this right? This looks like a very interesting miniseries to me. You wrote one called A Friend of the Family.
that's right.
What is
Yeah,
that about?
well, so as a yeah, one of the writers for A Friend of the Family, and that's a show which is about it's based on there's a Netflix documentary called Abducted in Plain Sight about a girl who gets abducted twice by the same family friend. It's kind of takes place in Idaho with a Mormon family. And the Friend of the Family is a kind of adaptation of that we did for Peacock.
Hmm.
And it's really just, it's a kind of yeah, it's a dramatization of that series, and kind of going through everything that happens to this family, partly because they're just really naive, partly because they're very trusting, partly the Mormon church lets them down in some ways, even though I don't think they'd characterize it that way. That's how I'd characterize it. And so it was really interesting to take this story, which happened to be set. My wife is from Idaho, and she actually grew up in a town about 20 miles away from where the story actually took place. And so to kind of engage with this real life story and make it into something that hopefully is effective. So, and then I'm working on another show right now, which I'm not sure if I'm allowed to talk to. That's where I am right now. I'm in an office on Sunset Boulevard, kind of in Hollywood, and about to go into the writer's room as soon as we finish this interview, which is being done for Apple, and I think it's a really exciting show, and hopefully I'll be able to talk about it soon. When I can, I'll let you know so that you can
Yeah, that would
let
be
your
great. I'd love to get you back on and
yeah,
talk about it, and I won't keep
yeah,
you too
sure.
much longer, but we should talk about something really important since we're
Okay.
here.
Yeah.
Your wife's new book. Your wife has a new
Oh
book.
yeah.
I just wanted to
Yeah.
touch on that.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not weird fiction, but it's Brian Evanson's wife, so
No,
let's
no,
go
it's
ahead.
true. It's true. So I actually I didn't
Oh,
bring it,
nice.
but I
There you
have it. So
go.
this is her book, The Unofficial Alcatraz Handbook. Kristen Tracy's my wife.
A complete guide to the questions most asked
Oh,
about The Rock.
yeah. So
That's
she
great. I'm gonna
yeah,
have to
so
get this.
it's a good book. She worked as a volunteer gardener on Alcatraz for a long time. And in fact, we actually spent the night once in a cell on Alcatraz, which
Oh
was
my
when we were
God.
kind of first
How was
together.
that?
It was pretty amazing. I mean, it was very strange to wake up in a prison cell, and and the island, like in the morning, it's just beautiful and quiet, but it was very, very interesting. And so because she did that, and because she kind of knows all the rangers and things out there, she really researched this book. I think it's the most accurate book on Alcatraz that's out there. She read so much, even though it's a children's book, it's for 10 and up. It's a very well researched, kind of dense, book that just goes into a lot of detail about what's there, and what you can do, and what you should look for. So it's things like, are there really dungeons on Alcatraz,
Oh wow.
under Alcatraz? And there are, spoiler. So it kind of goes through those sorts of things. Talks about some of the famous cases like Al Capone, some of the famous prisoners like Al Capone, or the escape attempts, that sort of thing.
So just again, it's the unofficial Alcatraz handbook, and Kristen Tracy is your wife?
That's right. Yeah,
Okay.
there it is. Mhm.
All right. Um, also, talk about other things too, but guys, don't forget, if you don't have a copy of Good Night Sleep Tight Again, trying to hold it where there's no glare, uh,
Hmm.
I'm telling you, you really should get it. And if you've not read Brian before, uh, like I said, he's up there with Laird with the feeling of dread that he's able to invoke in me. So, yeah, guys, I think you're really going to enjoy this. Um,
Thank you.
Brian, I think most, if not all, writers and creative people would look at you and go, "Wow, this guy's really successful. I want to be this guy." Do you feel that way? What has to happen in order for you to feel successful in life and in your work?
I mean, I feel like I've gotten to an interesting place, and I'm happy with it, but I also like I don't think there's ever a moment when you're like, oh, I arrived. Everything's okay now. It's like by the time a book is coming out, like by the time Good Night Sleep Tight's coming out, I'm already thinking about the next book and the next project. And so there is a kind of weird disconnect between what's happening kind of publicly and what's happening, what you're doing kind of behind the scenes. So yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of, I mean, I think the thing I would say is that, there's been various frustrations along the way. There's moments where something could happen and it doesn't happen, that sort of thing. And I think the thing that I've realized over the years is that the best writers, it's not necessarily that they start out as the most talented writers, but they're persistent and they don't stop if they meet, rejection in some way. So my first, actually, first book, I sent it out over and over again and had no success with it, and then finally got it published. But it took forever to for that to happen. And the same, I think that one of the first stories I submitted it 30 or 40 times before someone took it. So I think just being willing to persist is a huge thing.
It really is.
And then, yeah. And then I think one of my colleagues at Cal Arts, Janet Sarbanes, talks about just putting in the work. It's like if you're a writer, you write and you write and you write and you write, and you figure it out as you go. And you might have to write for 1,000 hours before you figure some things out that kind of give you a groundwork or a basis to really do what you want to do. So I feel like every book, I feel like I'm figuring and solving certain kinds of things, but they also raise other kinds of questions and allow me to kind of investigate other sorts of things. So yeah.
I couldn't agree more about persistence. There's just so many things in life where you don't have all the maybe advantages somebody else does.
Yeah.
But if you have that quality of never giving up,
Yeah.
eventually you're going to arrive where you'd like to arrive.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I didn't, yeah, I went to BYU, I went to the Mormon school, and I ended up teaching at some nice schools. But it's funny, like when I was at Brown, it's like everybody has an Ivy League degree. I didn't have one. But I also was like, I had something else. I mean, I was persistent and I just wrote a lot. Um,
before we go, could you talk about uh, things like Dead Space and Aliens? And
yeah, Mm.
you wrote The Lords of Salem with Rob Zombie, is that right?
I did. Yeah, that's
Wow,
correct. Yeah.
that's pretty cool, Brian.
Yeah. So I published those books under a slightly different name, BK Evenson, which obviously is not hiding me very well. But I've done various kinds of adaptations and also done collaborative projects with people. So I did yeah, Lords of Salem was something where I had Rob's script for Lords of Salem and adapted it into something that we kind of went back and forth on in terms of shaping it and making it into a novel. And that's an interesting case because it's the adaptation of Lords of Salem is based on what the script was. And then, as often happens when you're shooting a movie, it's like the final movie was so long that they cut a lot that was in the script. So it's actually, we really thought of the movie and the book as going together in terms of the book is filling out things that you don't have in the movie. And then, I wrote a book called Feral with James DeMonaco, who's the guy who did the Purge movies,
Mm, yeah.
um, which is kind of not exactly a zombie movie, but kind of in that zombie adjacent space. And that was similar. He was really a pleasure to work with. He was really a nice guy. And then, it all started because I was at a book fair, and there was someone there from Dark Horse Comics, and we got talking, and she decided I would be great to write either an Aliens or a Predators novel. So that was the first adaptation I did. She asked me if I would do one or the other, and at the time I was like, oh, I don't know. It's like, it seemed a little strange, and she said, just write a one-page summary of what you would do if you did this. And so I said, okay, I can do that. So I sat down and wrote a one-page summary, and it ended up being like a 10-page summary. And very quickly I realized I had an idea for an aliens novel that would be really fun to write. So I did the aliens novel, and then suggested Jeff Vandermeer for the Predators novel. That was his South China Sea Predators novel.
What's the
And
name of the
then
Aliens novel, Brian?
it's called Aliens No Exit is what
Okay,
it's called.
okay.
And I think it's been reproduced in some of those omnibuses as well. So you can, it's very hard to find the original paperback of it, but there's Aliens omnibuses from Dark Horse, and it's in one of those. Um, and then that kind of led me to doing I did a Halo novella for a book about Halo the video game, and then I did two Dead Space books. And that was great. I love doing the Dead Space books partly because I'd played those games. They were very much to my taste. It's like the sensibility really fit.
Yeah, I was
So I,
about to ask you if maybe expound on that just for a second.
sure,
What is
yeah.
it you love about Dead Space? The games and the universe, let's say.
I mean, I love that it has that kind of science fiction thing, but it has a horror aspect to it as well. So it is kind of in this weird space, I think. Not exactly, but at least feels weird adjacent. So I love that about it. And then I also just think it's the atmospherics are great. The body horror stuff in it is great as well. It's the fact that you are fighting these creatures that keep on kind of assembling in strange ways is really amazing. So all those things just really appealed to me about it. It was different than any game I'd seen at the time. There's probably games now that are moving in a similar direction, but it was kind of outrageous and different and just really really fun.
I think you know that the show is live right now, and then a lot of people watch the recording later. So I've got a couple of comments to read to you. Alan
Sure.
Hughes says the series goes full cosmic horror by the third entry. Jeremiah says, love Dead Space Martyr. And he also adds a lot of religious themes too. I think he's
There
talking,
are there are a
yeah.
lot of religious themes in it. Yeah. And the great thing when I was writing Dead Space Martyr is so I wrote this proposal up, same kind of thing where it ended up being about a 10-page proposal. And at the end, I was like, I could do this thing that I would love to do, but it's going to change the lore of the show. So I thought they will never let me do this. Or the shit, not I said lore of the show, but lore of the game. And then I just sent the proposal in anyway, and they're like, "Yeah, that sounds great. We can make this all work." And so the great thing is like what you think you know about one of the characters, Michael Altman, in the first game turns out to be just not true. And they were great in terms of just being willing to let me do that. So that was just it was really fun to write that book, Dead Space Martyr. So I'm very proud of that book, actually. I'm glad that Jeremiah likes it. So and yeah, there's definitely religious themes through there because of the unitology, which is the religion that's part of that world. So yeah.
uh,
And
I
then
think,
the other question, the
yeah,
other
sorry.
comment, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yes, it's like definitely by the third entry of Dead Space, it's like full cosmic horror. I agree with that. So that was yeah really fun to work on. So
Alan's my games expert, maintains the games page on the site.
oh
So
great,
so
oh
he knows what
awesome.
he's talking about too.
Yeah,
Uh, yeah. I know you got to get to the writer's room. I just
yeah,
appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. And
you bet. Yeah,
it feels to me that I've just only scratched the surface. So I'd love
yeah.
to talk to you again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to come back, and once I get permission to talk about the nature of the show I'm working on, I will I'll let you know, and hopefully we can work it out.
Last question. You're working on this TV show, but is another book coming soon, or is this what your
Yeah.
focus?
I mean, it's definitely my focus now, but it's only been my focus for I just got hired in it 2 weeks ago, so it's pretty new
Oh
still.
yeah,
Um, yeah, so I have a book that's finished, which is called Phantom Limb, which is a sequel to Last Days, which is a novel that I wrote about an amputation cult, and that's scheduled to come out in I think late 2025 or early 2026. It's a ways away.
yeah.
And that's the next thing. After that, I don't know what the next thing's going to be. And to be honest, it's like the next 23 weeks, I'm going to be 21 weeks now, I'm going to be in the TV room. So I'm not sure that I'll get that much of my own fiction done until that's over.
All right. Well, again, the name of the book is Good Night, Sleep Tight. It's chilling by Brian Evan. No, that's my comment. It's chilling. Good Night,
Hmm.
Sleep Tight by Brian Evanson. And then the title. of your wife's book again?
It's the unofficial Alcatraz Handbook is my wife's book.
Awesome. I'm gonna have
Yeah,
to get that.
cool.
Well, Brian, I'll let you get to the writer's room. Thank you for taking the time to
Thank you.
chat with me.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
All right. I hope to talk with you soon.
Sounds good.